How's it going, everybody? Welcome to week 3 here. Moving right along, learning more about Japanese culture. So we've got food down. We've got topography, geography. Hopefully you know a little more about Japan, where things are. I uploaded your Padlet 2's a Japanese Geography 2. It's in the Student Resource tab, sub-module, so you can take a look at that. I encourage you to. These are really cool places in Japan. If you're planning to go to Japan, this is kind of like a little travel itinerary. You guys did covered a lot of really cool spots, some places that I'd never heard of that were really interesting, and yeah, really encourage you. It's your time to learn about Japan. So if you go through that, if there's things that are really interesting to you, just Google quickly, like Google Maps, Apple Maps, whatever. Plug these things in and take a look at where they are. Like, kind of get familiar with parts of Japan, particularly major cities. A lot of people did things in Kyoto, things like that, or temples there. Kind of see where these things are. Hopefully by the end of this class, you'll have sort of a better mental map of Japan and how things are laid out. And then that's kind of what that assignment was all about. Focus on one thing, but as a class, kind of look at a lot of different spots. So hopefully you have a better understanding of Japanese geography, topography, where things are. And then this week we're kind of shifting to another part of culture I think is important is, history. Where do these things come from? How did people get to Japan? Where do these sort of cultural traits start to get developed? And so that's kind of what we talked about this week. Early migrations. How did people even show up on these islands? And we talked about that early migration and, the oceans, height and things like that. People were able to walk to Japan, and then when after the Ice Age and the oceans rose, they were kind of isolated. It gives us the Jomon period, sort of hunting gathering, and then with the influx of new peoples from China and Korea, with them brought new technologies, rice, metalworking, pottery, some new forms of language. Later on, some new forms of belief, particularly Buddhism. All of those things mixing into Japan, and you have the Jomon groups. Also talked about the Ainu peoples, which are another indigenous groups of Japan as well in those lectures. So yeah, so take a look at that. Hopefully you have a little bit better idea of where early Japan came from. When we got all the way up in the Nara period, which is sort of seen as the first sort of coalescence of Japan under sort of a political leadership, with the first capital of in the Kansai period area of Nara, which will then shift to Kyoto very quickly. We'll get into, but that's a kind of a whole history period to itself that we get to a little bit later. The other big thing there was the Yamato family, the Japanese imperial family, which again, hopefully from that lecture, it's one of the longest running imperial families in the world. It is the longest line of imperial rulers. Rulers, again, hopefully from that lecture, you kind of see that one thing that kept the imperial family kind of together is that they weren't always rulers. A lot of times they were more ceremonial groups related with Shintoism, which we'll talk about next week. So don't worry if you're I brought up some Shinto people and Shintoism in this lecture, but we'll flush that out next week. Yeah. So I think that's about it. Hopefully it was interesting. The last little bit there is the reading for this week. It's on the concept of IMI, which is, I think sometimes, I talk about this in the lecture and in the readings talk about this as maybe like the most distinct aspect of Japanese culture from Western culture is this sort of ambiguity, this sort of never really being straightforward, right? In Japan, you never really want to just directly confront someone, and in the book talks about why that is. Kind of trace back to some of this Jomon period, sort of agricultural communities keep everyone working together. That if you disrupt the boat, then bad things can happen. So there's this ambiguity that you never really want to be really direct. It's embedded with language. If you speak Japanese, you'll get it. Like, you never really use like subjects of sentences. Everything's kind of a lot more passive language constructions. So you're never really direct with people. You never really want to say no, right? You always want to kind of work your way around that, which again, from the Western perspective, can be a challenge because we're very a little more individualistic. I want to do this. No, I'm not going to do that. I want to do this. You would never in Japan. You would never say that. You would try to find a medium that worked out. And this relates to other terms. Now we can kind of start bringing those together. Things like hone and tatamai, right? Your personal opinions sometimes need to be pushed down in order for the tatamai, the social or public world. And aimai is a way, it's the ambiguous way to do that. So, yeah. So if you're ever in Japan or with Japanese culture, just understand that there's, that there is going to be this sort of negotiation. Everyone's kind of trying to like see how it works for everyone, which just be patient and you'll get there. So, but I think it's good to know, a good concept to kind of have in mind culturally. Yeah, and so this week, the assessments for this week are a discussion post, a short response. There's 3 questions. Choose one of those, not all 3 of them, please. One is like the history that we talked about this week. What kind of discuss the lectures and the material from this week. Just history of Japan up from Jomon to Nara. Second question goes back to last week's stuff, sort of geography. How does the geography, topography of Japan make it the way it is, which you can kind of combine with some of the history this week we talked about. And then the third one talks about the readings, kind of like a review of the main topics of the readings we've had up to this point. So choose one of those, not all 3 of those. Choose one of those. Upload it by Friday at 4 to the discussion tab. It should be embedded in there. You just click on it, and then by Monday at 4, respond to a couple more. And again, I encourage people to, whatever you've written on, respond to the other 2 questions that you haven't written on to kind of get an idea of what other people said about that. So, yeah. And then the last thing today, this week, is I want you to be thinking about your final project. So there's a final project in this course. Really, it's totally up to you. Just pick something you've always wanted to learn about Japan and learn about it. That's what your final project of this semester is. So anything. I mean, there's nothing you can't learn about. But I want you to choose that now and start thinking about that. Start working on it. Have that in mind as we go through this course. If you have a few topics you're not sure, put all those up there and discuss them a little bit in depth. And I'll look at them and kind of give some feedback, some suggestions about, what might be more feasible, what might be, easier or more interesting, maybe. If they're kind of broad, no problem. I'll help you give suggestions on how to narrow those down. But do that by Friday. Get your suggestions there. So that's that. Great. Just some announcements today at 9. If you're interested, we're going to have a Lunar New Year on campus celebration with some tea and various things. And then the Cherry Blossom Festival in Waimea is this weekend. So if you're interested in that, a little Japanese culture for you there. And then, a couple other announcements. There's some workshops coming up. Take a look at the student resources as well. Great. I think that's it. Have a good rest of your week.